Good evening and welcome. It's great to see so many of you here joining us this evening. So the evening will consist of a talk from Sharon, and then we will have time for question and answers. So Sharon Dircks is joining us. She's a senior tutor at the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics. She's originally from a scientific background. She has a PhD in brain imagery from the University of Cambridge and has held research positions at the University of Oxford and at the Medical College of Wisconsin in the USA. She lives in Oxford with her husband and 2 young children, and I'm just going to hand over to her and we'll see her at the end for some questions.
Thank you very much, Beth, and thank you for taking time to come out this evening to hear how somebody might answer this question, am I just my brain? One of my earliest childhood memories is of sitting by a window on a rainy day watching the drops splash against the pane, and like all normal children, I spent most of my life racing around, but at this particular moment I was still and my mind had time to drift, and I found a series of questions came into my head. Why can I think? Why do I exist? Why am I a living, breathing, conscious person who experiences life? I don't really remember where those questions came from. I wasn't raised in a religious home. The questions were just there, unprompted. And I know that I'm not the first to have this kind of moment. When we sit still for long enough, if indeed we do, then all kinds of things bubble to the surface of our consciousness. Conscious awareness seems to be central to what it means to be a living, breathing human being. But what is a human being? Well, this is a question that has occupied people at every stage of human history. What exactly are we? Are we advanced primates? Are we machines? Are we souls confined to a body longing to escape? Are we just physical beings, or is there more to us than this? Well, the question, what is a human being, asks a question of identity. And many answers are offered on the question of identity today. The fashion and cosmetics industry might say, you are your body. The financial world might say, you are your income. Politicians might say, you are your influence. The academy might say you are what you write and what you publish. And neuroscientists have recently weighed in on this conversation surrounding identity, and they say your brain defines you. You are your brain. The choices that you make, for good or ill, the personality that you have, the behaviors you exhibit, even the religious beliefs that you may or may not have, are all dictated by the activity in your brain. Now, I'm sure I don't need to convince such an audience of how incredible the human brain is. This is more developed in humans than in any other creature. It contains somewhere between 80 and 100 billion cells. At any moment, these cells are sending thousands of impulses at speeds of over 250 miles an hour, generating at any moment enough electricity to power an LED light. Gives another angle on the notion of a light bulb moment. This hive of activity in this 1.5 kilo organ sitting between your ears uses 20% of your body's energy, which is why when you're revising and working hard, you're really hungry. That's feeding your brain. And yet it takes up only 2% of your body's weight. What an extraordinary thing the brain is. And I'm certainly not here to do down the human brain. In fact, I love it, and I have spent over 10 years conducting research using functional MRI. I think there's an MRI lab here in Southampton, but I spent over 10 years studying the human brain. I did a PhD at the University of Cambridge. I went on to do some postdoctoral work of human drug abuse in the Medical College of Wisconsin in the States. And I also have done some research at the University of Oxford before moving into this very different area of kind of giving reasons why Christians believe the things that they do. And so this experience has given me first-hand insight into the precision and beauty of different brain imaging techniques, but also insight into what science can and cannot tell us about humanity. And here's the thing. Just because the human brain is extraordinary, does it necessarily follow that everything it means to be a human being can be explained in terms of brain chemistry and electrical activity? After all, some brilliant scientists do believe this. One such person is Francis Crick, who you'll probably know in the context of his discovery of the DNA double helix, along with James Watson, for which they won the joint Nobel Prize in 1962. Well, later on in the 1990s, Francis Crick, in a book called The Astonishing Hypothesis, said this about the human being. He said, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. As Lewis Carroll might have phrased it, you're nothing but a pack of neurons. And he says this hypothesis is so alien to the ideas of most people alive today that it can truly be called astonishing. Well, many years later, this hypothesis is far from alien. It seems commonplace. In fact, some no longer consider it to be a hypothesis. It is seen by some as scientific fact that you are your brain. And this view, you are your brain, has also filtered into popular culture as well and is being expressed by non-scientists such as historian Yuval Harari. Harari is the author of 2 best-selling books, Sapiens, which looks at the history of humankind, and Homo Deus, which looks at the future of humanity. Together, these 2 books have sold millions of copies worldwide. And in Homo Deus, Harari asserts that over the last few decades, biologists have reached the firm conclusion that the man or woman pressing the buttons and drinking the tea from a vending machine, that's the context of the quote, is also an algorithm. Humans are algorithms. In other words, humans are automated. Humans are machines. Well, you might be asking, so what? What difference does it make what you believe about human identity? Well, it actually matters quite a lot. If we are simply our brains, then the implications are very significant. The first implication, or the first question we need to ask is, if we are simply our brains, no more and no less, then are we really free and able to make meaningful decisions, or do we just do what our brains tell us? There are implications for human freedom. Secondly, for those that hold to a particular religious belief or claim to have had a particular religious experience, is that real, or is that just generated by the brain and therefore all in your head? Thirdly, there are implications for ethical decisions. What is the value of a human life? And if we are simply our brains, then is personhood dependent on having a fully functioning, healthy brain? And if so, what status do we assign to those whose brains are not fully functional or fully developed, such as the unborn or premature babies, or those who are brain damaged, or those with degenerative diseases? There are implications for ethical decision making. And finally, there are implications for the future of artificial intelligence. If the human person is a machine, if the human brain is a machine, and that is the person, then will there one day be conscious androids walking the streets? Will human consciousness be something that can be replicated artificially in its entirety? So the answer to the answer that you give to this question, am I just my brain, actually has far-reaching implications that are not just for the neuroscientist, that are not just for the philosopher. They are mainstream, and they have very far-reaching implications. Now, many would agree that it is not enough to simply talk about the brain. We also need to talk about the mind. There are two different things at play. There is the brain, with all of its neurons and electrical activity and hormones and synapses and chemicals. And then there is the mind, with all of its thoughts and feelings and emotions and memories and decisions. And so a key question that we need to ask is, what is the relationship between these two things? And this is the million-dollar question. And this is not a new question that has suddenly risen to the surface because of the rise and success of neuroscience. This has been debated for centuries. The relationship between the mind and the brain, or historically the soul and the body. How do you get from brain cells to thoughts? How do you get from electrical activity to, I've had a really hard day today? How do you get from brain chemistry to what it is like to be you? Is it even possible? And of course, the perspective driving some of this discussion is that mind and brain are essentially the same thing. Mental states are brain states. Mental processes are brain processes, which is kind of another way of saying there isn't really anything it is like to be you. There is only brain activity. But surely this is an absurd way of thinking about human beings. For starters, it's incoherent. It's the person expressing that view is saying that my first-person perspective is that there is no first-person perspective. There is only brain activity. And we don't live as though that is the case. We write and read autobiographies, by and large, assuming the truthfulness of somebody's first-person perspective on a particular situation. We're told by mindfulness gurus to focus in on this inner self for a better state of well-being. Even the post-truth society that we're told we now live in defines truth by individual experience. So which is it? Are we post-truth? Or is there such a thing as having an inner you as well? We also treat other people as if they are conscious beings with a unique perspective on the world. We experience outrage and anger at things like human trafficking, humanitarian crises, and climate change precisely because we believe that the people involved are not simply packs of neurons, but conscious beings who experience suffering. This is an absurd view, an absurd way of thinking about human beings. And Harari, a non-scientist, states that scientists have reached a firm conclusion about this. But this is not the case. What the science has shown us is that mind and brain are connected. They are clearly connected. If you put someone in an MRI scanner and ask them to use their mind, and brain scientists do this all the time, using very careful experimental design. You give them a mental task to do using their memory or their vision or something. What do you see? Yeah, you see brain networks activated. And so mind and brain are clearly connected and integrated. That is what the science is telling us. But just because mind and brain are connected does not mean they are identical. That is actually going beyond what the science is telling us and making a kind of a worldview statement about that science. Let me try and show you a little bit more, explain a little bit more as to why mind and brain are not necessarily the same thing. Perhaps some of you have had one of these today. I've definitely had a few. Imagine I were to ask you to describe to me the smell of coffee, and describe it to me in physical terms, because we're trying to say, look, human beings can only be described in physical terms, right? So describe to me the smell of coffee physically. Well, perhaps we can get close by drawing the chemical structure of caffeine. You might want to tell me about the physiology that's going on as I swallow and digest a cup of coffee. But does that get me any closer to the smell of coffee? It doesn't. You have to smell it, and then you understand the smell of coffee. You need to experience it. And philosophers in this whole conversation talk about qualia. There are qualitative experiences that we have all the time in life that are impossible to describe physically. Another example might be seeing the colour red or tasting watermelon. And there are many scientists and philosophers that believe that brain processes alone are not enough to explain qualia. It's not the whole story. Imagine I was to do an experiment finding out what it's like for you to revise for an exam, to go through your finals. And we decided I'm going to put an EEG cap on you 24/7. I'm going to monitor all of the signals coming from the surface of your scalp. We might stick you in an MRI scanner, perhaps every couple of days, take some structural scans, take some functional scans. And we collect a lot of brain data. And that will tell us some really helpful things about what's going on in your body while you revise for an exam. Will it tell us everything we need to know about what it is like for you to revise for an exam? No. We need to talk to you. It's not enough to simply get inside your brain. We need to get inside your mind. And for that, we need to have a conversation with you and ask what it is like to cope with stress and anxiety, depression, unrealistic expectations, poor sleep habits. We need to talk to you. And so brain processes may tell us some things, but they don't tell us everything that we need to know, because you do have a unique first-person perspective on the world that needs to be told. You see, brain processes and human experience are two very different things. And how we get from brain reactions to human experience, as I said earlier, has occupied philosophers and scientists for centuries. And many atheists and agnostics acknowledge, as well as theists, they acknowledge that this is a hard problem to solve. And there's no consensus currently on the mind-brain relationship. There are lots of different positions out there. So much so that philosopher David Chalmers Australian philosopher, director of the Centre for Consciousness at Australian National University, has named this the hard problem of consciousness. He distinguishes between easy problems and hard problems. Now, easy problems are not easy. In fact, whole lifetimes of research are taken up in their quest. But compared to the hard problem, they're trivial. Easy problems would include things like looking at what's happening in the brain when you move from one state of consciousness to another, such as from wakefulness to sleep. This, that's an example of an easy problem where you're looking at the brain areas that are switched on and off when you move from being awake to being asleep. Or another example might be what happens in the brain when you move from being awake to being anaesthetized. You're moving from one state of consciousness to another. So those are easy problems, which of course are not easy. The hard problem is the question of how you explain conscious experience, how you get from brain cells to what it is like to be you. Or as Baroness Susan Greenfield, Fellow of the Royal Society, Professor of Physiology at the University of Oxford, as Baroness Greenfield put it during a lecture on consciousness in Melbourne in 2012. Listen to the language that she uses, an agnostic, I believe. How does the water of boring old brain cells and sludgy stuff translate into the wine of phenomenological subjective experience? How do you get from water to wine? And in fact, there's a lot of really interesting data coming out of neuroscience. In fact, we don't even need to step outside of the realm of neuroscience to make the case that there is more to a human being than simply their brains. You see, what do you do when the brain is damaged but the mind is working? Some of you may be familiar with this groundbreaking brain imaging study that was conducted in Cambridge and published in Science in 2006. The lead investigator, Adrian Owen, now in Montreal, I believe, studied patients who were in a persistent vegetative state to see if there were signs of consciousness. Now, the way to test for consciousness is to see if a person can follow commands. But of course, how do you test for consciousness in somebody who can't speak or move? Well, you can ask them to respond using their mind, and that is what they did. They were able to train some patients to do the following two things. Imagine they were playing tennis, and imagine moving around your house. If you imagine that you're playing tennis right now, what happens in your brain is all the networks to do with motor control, motor function light up. A very well-defined set of brain networks. And if you were to imagine moving around your house at home, what happens is a very well-defined network of brain regions to do with spatial navigation light up. And they were able to train a proportion of patients in a persistent vegetative state to do both of these things. And then they took it one step further, and they gathered a series of biographical questions from family members, and they asked these questions to these patients, and they said, if you want to answer yes to this question, imagine you're playing tennis. And if you want to answer no to this question, imagine you're moving around your house at home. And what they found was that a small number answered the questions correctly, showing that they were conscious to some extent, despite having had significant brain damage. What are we to make of these discoveries? Surely if you are your brain, end of story, we wouldn't see this kind of data. And Owen, not a theist in any way, summarizes his research in this way. He says, we have discovered that 15 to 20% of people in the vegetative state are fully conscious, although they never respond to any form of external stimulation. Many really are as oblivious and incapable of thought as their doctors believe, but a sizable number are experiencing something quite different. Intact minds adrift deep within damaged bodies and brains. Even the field of neuroscience shows us that we are complex beings. There's more to us than just the activity of our brain. The state of the brain and the state of the mind are arguably different things. And on the basis of a lifetime of clinical research, some have drawn some very interesting conclusions. One such person would be Michael Egnor, Professor of Neurosurgery at Stony Brook University School of Medicine in New York. And he makes the point that many of his patients are missing large parts of their brains and yet have quite good minds. He even recalls holding a conversation with someone while removing a section of their brain from their head. And after 30 years of working in this field, Egnor has concluded that the mind of a person is simply beyond the workings of their brain. And he comments in this way. He says this: materialism, the view that matter is all that exists, is the premise of much contemporary thinking about what a human being is. And yet, evidence from the laboratory, the operating room, and clinical experience points to a less fashionable conclusion. Human beings straddle the material and immaterial realms. And that's someone that spent 30 years in this field, worked with all kinds of patients with all kinds of problems and disorders. And this is not the only data out there. There's all kinds of other data that I could talk about that just illustrate and highlight the fact that one thing could be happening in the physical brain, another thing entirely happening with the mind. And perhaps we need to say that in reality, we live as though we do the thinking, not our brains. Brains don't think, algorithms don't think, people think using their brains. And there are other ways to describe this mind-brain relationship that make more sense of a human being, and that many agnostics and atheists subscribe to, as well as Christians. And I'm happy to say more about those in the question time, if you would like me to. Perhaps a helpful kind of way to end is to think about the question, why do we have a mind in the first place? Because even if all of our questions about the scientific workings of the mind and its relationship to the brain, even if all of those questions are answered, there are still some questions that are left unanswered. Why do we have a mind in the first place? Why does it exist? And why do 10-year-old children sit by windows watching the rain and suddenly that question appears from nowhere? And does a purely physicalist approach offer the best explanation for the human mind? Well, many argue not. The forces of nature alone are not enough to explain the human mind, and therefore we need to look to other possibilities. And I suppose it really comes down to this, a little bit like what that opening video was saying. Is what we can see with our eyes all that there is in this world? Is this material world all that there is? If we entertain the possibility that God exists, does that help us make sense of the human mind? Well, a number of key philosophers and scientists argue yes, it does. Because if God exists, then mind has always existed. Mind is fundamental to the universe, and before there was anything physical, there was mind. The very first words of the Bible say, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." In other words, God has always existed and has somehow made human beings in his image. And what that means is has imprinted something of himself onto humanity. And therefore we have a mind because God has a mind. We think because God thinks. We are conscious because God is a conscious, rational being. You see, if God exists, then we actually have some really persuasive grounds for making sense of the human mind. And there is hope for solving this hard problem of consciousness, because it says we didn't just start with matter. We started with consciousness. God is a conscious being and has made people a bit like himself. He has extended that consciousness beyond himself to humanity. You know, the question, "Am I just my brain?" asks about identity. And those of us that seek to explain human beings purely in physical terms really have a hard job explaining why there would be anything significant about us. You know, if the scientific narrative is all that we have to go on, we are very, very insignificant indeed. We sit here tonight in Southampton on a spinning mass of rock, metal and water and gas that is 4.5 billion years old, in a cosmos of around 12 billion years old. Homo sapiens have been around about 200,000 years old. And so if we think of the time since Earth formed until now as one 24-hour period, humans, the human race, appeared at the last second at 11 p.m., 11:59 p.m. and 59 seconds. You see, naturalistically speaking, scientifically speaking, the human race is a blink in the eye of the cosmos, and one human life even less so. We are unbelievably insignificant. Is that the only narrative that there is? Absolutely not. The Judeo-Christian framework says something very different about human significance. Psalm 8 is like a song from the Bible, tells us that God made human beings a little lower than heavenly beings and crowned them with glory and honor. In other words, human beings are made closer to angels than they are to the rest of the animal kingdom. And if that is true, then there is an identity to human beings that runs so much deeper than simply the scientific narrative, so much deeper than simply the activity of our brains. We are so much more than machines. You see, if God exists, then human beings are sacred. Human beings are of immeasurable value and worth, every single one of us. And we are created for a life of meaning and purpose, regardless of the condition of our body and our brain. And if God exists, then human beings are made by God and are known by God and have capacity themselves to know God precisely through their conscious awareness. You could argue that is why it exists, so that we can relate to the God who made us, who knows us, who loves us, and who actually entered human history as Jesus and died for us, so that a whole vista can be opened up to us in terms of our relationship with God. And actually, that is what I came to discover as an undergrad, perhaps at a similar age to you. My questions about consciousness as a child led me to the person of Jesus Christ as an adult. I arrived to study biochemistry just down the road in Bristol in the 1990s, an agnostic. And I assumed that science and God were incompatible. And I was invited to a Guerrilla Christian event in my first week, which is where there was 4 Christians in a row. You can ask them whatever you like. And I sat through this event, and about halfway through I put my hand up and said, surely you can't believe in God and be a credible scientist at the same time. And I was told, yes, you can. I mean, that's a bit like asking somebody to choose between, programming languages and Bill Gates as the reason for Microsoft Office. Those two things are not incompatible. In fact, together they provide a complete explanation. And I was told that, science and belief in God are just offering different levels of explanation. They're almost like different layers that together provide a more complete picture of the world. That actually was a game changer for me. I'd never heard anything like that before. It set me asking a lot more questions. It set me grilling a lot more Christians. And I did that for about 18 months. And I looked at, the historicity of the Gospels. Can we even trust what they say? Who is Jesus? What did he come to do? Why is it even relevant to me? And I got to the stage where I didn't have all of the answers to my questions, but I realized that I had enough to know that this actually made sense. It actually was intellectually credible and existentially relevant. It actually did help me make sense of my life, and I decided to follow Jesus around Easter time of my second year, and I have never looked back from that moment. And it was amazing to continue as a scientist, studying the world that God had made, but also knowing the one behind it all. And it was amazing to kind of discover that deeper identity that is rooted in a friendship with the God that made me, and a friendship that will last forever. And this friendship, I just want to say to you, this friendship is available to everyone. No one is excluded from that. Whatever you might have heard before, this is available to anyone that wants it. It's absolutely free. And we're asked by Jesus, his words to us are this: ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened. And if that is true, then there is hope for us all. Thank you for listening.
So the first question we have is, why does this point us towards the Christian God in particular?
Yeah, thank you for this question. And, much of the conversation around God and science can actually gets you to a kind of a monotheistic God, which would be, shared between the different views of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. Some refer to them as the Abrahamic faiths. I think the thing that I would say that points us particularly to the Christian God, or the Judeo-Christian God, is that this God is Trinity. And what that means is kind of one God in three persons. So God is one in his being and three in his person. And what that means is, when I say Genesis 1 says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, God is not just some kind of lonesome being out there in the universe. He is God the Father, God the Son, Jesus, and God the Holy Spirit. And that is a kind of a community of God, as it were, that Christians and theologians refer to as the Trinity. Now, there's something inherent in the use of mind that seems to be relational. And so here we have a reason a kind of a place where that came from, that actually there's that mind and that consciousness is already in existence in relationship within the Godhead, within the Trinity. And that's a slightly different situation to saying actually there's just one being that precedes all else, but there's no kind of outlet necessarily for that consciousness and that mind. So there's something unique about the Judeo-Christian framework which says that God is personal and relational, and that's partly why we can give a reason for why we're so why personhood is important to us as human beings and why relationships are important to us, because we're made by a God who embodies those and has embodied them since the beginning of time and before time. And so that's why I would say that this points us particularly to that God. But of course you can get to a monotheism by many of the things that I was saying as well.
So next question we have is, do you think it is possible to study the mind scientifically, separating it from the brain?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, the discipline of psychology, which is a relatively recent phenomenon, a 20th century phenomenon, is obviously a discipline that really is studying the mind. You know, the word comes from the Greek psyche, which is the Greek word for soul, and you know, the logic of the soul essentially is what the discipline ultimately means. And so, you know, of course it's possible to study the mind. This wasn't always the case. I think our kind of physicalist approach to the human person delayed the study of the mind until relatively recently. And so we can study it in its own, in and of itself. Of course, we can't ever separate it from the brain, but we can examine it as a distinct unit, but of course we can't separate it from its physical kind of moorings as well. And so, you know, and of course, yeah, but the discipline, you have psychologists that are interested in what's going on in the physical brain as well, but you have others that are you know, just interested in the mind in and of itself. So it depends. But what we can definitely say is that the mind is powerful in its effect on the brain. And, you know, it's good and right that it should be treated as its own discipline. You know, cognitive behavioral therapy is a therapy which is using mental techniques to bring a change physically, in your brain and then in your behavior as well. And it's actually emphasizing that the mind is powerful in its effect on the brain and deserves that attention. Another example would be the placebo effect. If you are given a blank drug that you believe can help you, it will have some therapeutic benefit in your life. That's a well-documented medical phenomenon. You know, the mind is powerful and deserves to be studied in its own right, and it is done.
Great. Next, I'm going to pair two questions together. Just I think they're asking similar things. On what basis a life without God is not sacred and meaningless? Why can't we live a full and meaningful life, even if we are living on a small spinning rock? And also, an optimistic view of nihilism allows us to assign our own meaning to our lives in the face of our cosmic insignificance. Why do we need religion?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And of course, what I'm not saying is that in order to lead a meaningful life, you need to believe in God or be a Christian. Of course not, because people lead meaningful lives all the time. My question is, where do you get that meaning from? And I guess, you know, thank you for, you know, just highlighting the nihilistic view that if, you know, there is no ultimate meaning, but and so we can either live with that in our face, which is a bit of a bleak outlook, or we can actually create our own sense of meaning, which of course we do all the times, and sometimes we do it to sort of paper over the cracks of the fact that there is no ultimate meaning. But I think we can't get away from the fact that there's something in us that wants meaning, that even if that's kind of self-created or whether we believe it's an ultimate thing, why is that? If we're actually holding to a narrative that says that we're just atoms and molecules, no more, no less, and we're sort of swept away as evolution continues on its course. And there's a dissonance there. And so if you're wanting to hold to that narrative, but you want there to be meaning as well, you need to ask yourself, where are you getting that from? And where does that longing for meaning come from? And I argue that it makes sense if God exists. Because there's an ultimate meaning with a capital N, that God exists, has made a world of meaning, has created human beings with purpose, for relationship with humans and with him. And it's within that framework that we find our ultimate meaning. And, to be a Christian it's not to live a kind of a restricted, slightly dull life. It's actually to be on an adventure with a God that knows me better than I know myself, and has actually kind of asked, me to do particular things. And so, I could argue that this longing for meaning is there because ultimate meaning is real, and sometimes it has to be pulled up from deep within us, but it is there.
Great. Next question is, many animals have feelings and thoughts. Do they also have a soul then?
Yeah, great question. And I think actually, if you even look at the Genesis narrative, the first verses of the Bible, which, by the way, is not a scientific account and definitely is not incompatible with what the scientific narrative is saying, and the scientific narrative seems to be, and also just those of us that have pets and animals, we will see that as they grow more and more complex, as you go higher and higher up the animal kingdom, it does seem to be that animals have some sort of emotional life. Dogs get scared when it's, when there's a storm. They experience, they seem to be happy, their tail wags, and we see this in primates, and those that have, there is obviously research that goes on with primates that look at their emotional life as well. And so clearly they have some sort of awareness, and they are responsive to their environment. And so there are clearly levels of consciousness in the animal kingdom that arguably increase as the complexity increases. But does that mean that they have an inner self, that they have a reflexive self-awareness? So they might be responsive to their environment, but do they get to the end of their day and say, oh, I had a really hard day today? Or do they ask themselves the question, why am I a dog and not a cat? I mean, it's quite hard to tell because you need to be able to ask. And that's the other thing to say. They don't have language in the same way that we do, so they can't express themselves in the same way. But maybe this is all pointing to the fact that they have some level of consciousness, but they don't have the same level that human beings have. That there is something unique about the human race in that we have this, we're capable of abstract thinking, we're capable of reflecting in on ourselves. And so, and this is a little bit what the Bible means when it talks about human beings being made in the image of God. There's something kind of step shift in relation to the animal kingdom that humans have been given, which sets them apart and then gives them responsibility to care for the rest of the animal kingdom. This is not a free ride to throw our weight around. It's actually a call to be responsible and to care for the animal kingdom.
Great. Next question is, does this or should this affect how we think about and treat problems with our mental health?
Yeah, thank you for this question, a really important one. I think it really does. So, I mean, if we follow a view to its logical conclusion that if you are simply your brain, then if someone has a mental disability, then the way to respond to that is to medicate. Because if all you are is chemical reactions, then we need to treat that with chemistry. We need to restate the balance. But I think, and I think the whole field of psychology and neuroscience is showing that that isn't enough. You actually do need to talk to the person, and I think, we need to treat someone as a whole person. So you need to treat the brain using antidepressants, but you also need to treat the mind using counselling with trained professionals who can have conversations about the things that need to be talked about. And that is actually treating you more as a human being, not less. And that's why it's really important to see that this view, you are your brain, offers you a diminished view of the human being. It says, I just want to look at you through this one lens, and that's you. Well, that's just not the case. And so really what we're trying to do here is to reinstate the whole person. And you could also even argue that there's a spiritual dimension that needs to be responded to in that. There's the brain, there's the mind, and then arguably there's the spirit. Many people believe we are spiritual beings, and so we need to treat that as well. And that's why Christians talk about prayer actually really making a difference, talking to God about things. And I think that this offers us a more holistic view of the human being and a more holistic way to walk through something like mental illness. The Christian faith talks about a God who cares about suffering, who actually knows what it is to suffer because he has been there. He himself has suffered. Right at the heart of the Christian faith is a cross, and Christians wear crosses around their neck, and that's really strange because that's a bit like wearing a crucifix, a bit like wearing a guillotine or an electric chair. You see, right at the heart of the Christian faith is a God who has suffered, and has suffered deep darkness, and has suffered actually in ways that go arguably way beyond anything that we have suffered, because he has on the cross taken the world's evil on his shoulders so that evil doesn't have to have the last word in our lives. And that includes every form of suffering that there is, including a struggle with anxiety or mental health. And so the Christian God says, talk to me. I want to hear about what it's like to go through that, and I want to walk with you through it and make a difference in it.
Great. So next one, can't we be conscious humans but just our brains? We have different experiences, we learn different things, we are genetically unique, we're still individual.
Thank you for the question. It's a great question, and I just want to highlight that we need to be clear here that that's not a scientific question, and that's not kind of what the science is saying. The science is saying that human consciousness and the brain are integrated, and when something happens in one, it's kind of reflected in the other by and large, and these two things are kind of integrated. We are integrated beings. And so your question is actually more of a philosophical one. Can't we be conscious humans but just our brain? There are obviously different views out there that I didn't highlight. One of them is that the brain generates consciousness, that the brain generates the mind. And that's how you get it. And maybe that's a little bit what you're saying. You start with the brain, that's all you need, and it grows in complexity, and then something new pops out. And that's the mind, that's your consciousness. And actually many people hold this view, agnostics, atheists, and Christians. The problem is that you are still left with this hard problem that David Chalmers talks about. How does the brain generate the mind? How do you get thoughts from physical things? It's not simply a case of those physical things getting more and more complex. That only leads to more and more complex physical things. How do you get thoughts from that? And actually, theists get around this by saying, look, if God exists, that we're not just in a closed system of cause and effect, of atoms and chemical reactions, there's more going on. And so if God exists, there's a way to bridge this chasm between brain activity and our thoughts. And so your question is a philosophical one, but it's not it's not what the science is saying, but there are philosophers that might argue that case with you. But theists say actually you end up running into a wall when you try and defend the brain generating the mind in a closed system of cause and effect. And it's actually easier to defend the original view that you are your brain, no more and no less, which is why many people take that view.
The next question is very similar, and I think you've touched on it a bit, but does the mind control the brain or the brain control the mind?
Yeah, thank you. I think that what neuroscience and psychology seems to show us is that these two things, both of those things happen. Now, if you are just your brain, it would just be one-way traffic. The brain drives everything about you because there isn't really such a thing as the mind. And of course, there are different views out there that are more sophisticated than that. And I do unpack those in my book, by the way, Am I Just My Brain, if you want to take a look at that. But but the neuroscience doesn't say that the brain simply drives everything. It says that the mind is powerful in its effect on the brain, as I've already said. One other example of that is quite a famous taxi driver study performed by Maguire about 15 years ago. She studied taxi drivers in London who have to learn the knowledge, the layout of the streets of London. And what she did was she imaged the brains of taxi drivers that were learning the knowledge and taxi drivers that weren't. And she measured the size of their hippocampus, which is a part of the brain which is responsible for working memory, which is the mind function that you're using when you're learning the knowledge. And what she found was that the taxi drivers that were using their memory had a larger hippocampus than those that weren't learning anything. And that was significantly different. And so this is another example to say that the mind can bring about changes in the brain. That's, when you're revising, you're putting stuff into your long-term memory, that's setting up neurons are connecting around your head so that you can remember stuff better. I mean, practice makes perfect works because the mind is powerful in its effect on the brain. And so, again, we need to be thinking of ourselves as integrated beings of mind, body, and arguably spirit as well.
Great. Next, again, I'm going to prepare two questions that are touching on similar topics. They are, is God just a creation of human mind to make them not feel worthless beings? And then we have also, we can't explain consciousness fully now, therefore God. We couldn't explain thunder and lightning once, so we assigned it to a god of Thor. Look how that went.
Okay, I might answer those separately. Let me just... Okay. Is God just a creation of the human mind to make them not feel worthless beings? Yeah, thank you. This is a really important question, which, is one of the kind of psychoanalytical critiques of the Christian faith, stemming from views from Freud and Feuerbach, which are kind of saying that, Christianity is a projection of the human longing for a kind of a father figure or a kind of heavenly comforter to kind of help sort of people cope with life, and often slightly socially awkward people to help them sort of get through life. And this held sway and is still a view that's out there today. But the problem is that actually it can also work the other way round. You could also make the case that atheism is a psychological crutch or projection to avoid having to answer to a higher being for your life. And that can be comforting as well. And so you can argue the heavenly, the kind of comfort view from an atheistic view or a theistic view. And, if God exists, then, if God doesn't exist, then the atheist might be right. But if God does exist, then the theist might be right. The question is, does God exist? So really this notion of just seeking comfort, it doesn't actually get us anywhere. It brings us back to the question, does God exist or not? And how are we going to answer that question? And you can look at all kinds of things. You could look at, you could look at the science God question like we're doing tonight. You could look at the question of suffering and ask, does it help us make sense of all the suffering in the world? We could look at, we could look at the reliability of the Bible. We could look at the natural world and beauty. And does it help us make sense of any of those things? And I guess what it really came down to for me was, did Jesus rise from the dead or not? Did one man in human history rise bodily from the dead, never to die again or not? And that actually really matters, if that's true or not. And if it's true, it actually is true for all of us. It's not simply a case of you do that, you believe that because that kind of helps you. That just kind of helps you get through life. Actually, being a Christian's quite hard. You're going against the grain. People believe all kinds of things out there. It's not easy. And don't think for 1 minute we're proposing something to you that is easy. But if it's true, it changes everything, and it changed everything for me. But if it's not true, obviously it's irrelevant, and we can all go home. It may be of some interest to you that one of the biographers of the life of Jesus is a man called Luke. And Luke was a medically trained man, a physician. And he actually, in his biography of Jesus' life, he documented all of his good teachings, his good moral teachings that have informed many of our laws in the Western world. But he also documented his miracles, and he also documented the virgin birth, the incarnation of Jesus, and the resurrection. As if to say that actually, to be a thinking person is highly compatible with being a person of faith, because everyone has faith in something. And we exercise that faith on the basis of evidence. You have faith, a level of faith in the transport system in Southampton. Is that on the absence of evidence? No, that's on the basis of the evidence. They show up on time, you have high level of faith. If they don't show up, you don't. But it's not on the absence. It's not a blind leap into the dark. And it's the same with Jesus. When people put their faith in Jesus in first century Palestine, it wasn't a blind leap into the dark to believe some impossible thing. It was, here is a living, breathing human being that treats people like no one else ever did, that spoke into the human condition like no one else ever did, and then rose from the dead like no one else ever did. And here is the evidence on which to base your faith. He doesn't ask you to stop being a thinking person. He says, have you examined the evidence for me? And will you go where the evidence leads? Some of you might want to pick up on the way out a copy of one of those biographies. It's called Uncover, and it's simply the biography of the life of Jesus. It can give you other books to say why you can trust it, why it's still reliable. But have a look for yourself. Don't just write it off without looking at the evidence. It's a long answer, sorry.
Great. Before we come back to the other one I asked, there's one in between, which is your personalities and emotions come from the frontal lobe. So when this is damaged, we are not the same person. So how can you separate mind and brain?
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. And again, I'm just, want to keep coming back to this idea that the mind and the brain are clearly connected. And when you damage the frontal lobe, which is to do with personality, yes, there are reflections in the personality of the person. And there probably are even stories in the room of that kind of experience. My mother-in-law has advanced dementia, and there you see the brain degenerates, and something of the person has changed and continues to change. But the question is, does that happen in its entirety? Or is there still a you that's in there? And, the story, I don't know if the person asking the question is thinking of Phineas Gage He's often talked about as an example of this. There's someone that was a railway worker in Vermont in the 1800s, and what they did in those days was they used a pole and they kind of poke dynamite into a rock, and then they light it and run, and that blows up some rock and clears another section, and they can build the railway. Well, Phineas Gage, as he was poking the pole in, a spark caught because of the friction, and it ignited the dynamite, and the pole went through his head and out, and he landed some numbers of feet away. People thought he was dead. But he wasn't. He was alive, and he went on to live for another 12 or so years, I believe. But what happened was a previously mild-mannered person became very profane, very ill-tempered, and people have often used this as an example of, surely you change the brain, you change the person, and therefore it's a like-for-like exchange. Well, others, such as Marilyn Robinson, make the case that this story has likely been embellished over time. And, you know, actually this man managed to retain his job and continue to work for another 12 years. And you can actually make a case that there are all kinds of other reasons why he might be upset, not least because a pole has been, you know, pushed through his head, for goodness sake. We need to treat people as whole people and not just as packs of neurons. And actually, maybe this case study makes the opposite point, that though despite significant damage to the brain, the person can continue to function. And if you have spoken to someone with advanced dementia, you will know that there are moments of lucidity. There are moments when it seems to be them. If you are just your brain, you wouldn't see that. I think there's more to us than simply what is going on neuronally. Thank you for the question.
Great. I think this will have to be our final question, but just going back to the one of, we can't explain consciousness fully now, therefore God. We couldn't explain thunder and lightning once, so he signed it to the god of Thor. Look how that went.
Yeah, so, you know, what I've tried to do tonight is not to say we can't explain consciousness, therefore believe in God. I'm not saying that. I'm actually saying, look, the view that you are just neurons is not the best way to view a human being. And it's not what a lot of scientists and philosophers are saying either. And it's not what the science is saying. And so there's more to us than that. And let's look at these other ways of explaining the relationship between the mind and the brain, because this one isn't enough. Now, that's what I've been trying to say. And then the other thing that I've been trying to say is that even if you get your head around all of that, there are still some questions that are unanswered. Why do you have a mind? Why do you exist? Why are you a thinking being? And those are not scientific questions. Those are not questions that are going to be answered by the scientific method. You need to step outside of science to arguably theology and apologetics and all of those different things. And so I'm not arguing here for a God of the gaps. I never was. Absolutely brilliant that we know about, thunder and lightning and all of the different interactions going on when that's happening. That only improves our understanding of the natural world. That doesn't diminish the possibility that God might have set that all going in the first place. And so there are different layers. And there are these physical explanations that we can give as a scientist, but that still leaves questions unanswered. Why do we exist in the first place? And so there's still very much room for God in that equation. And I really encourage you to, if you haven't considered the possibility of God or of Jesus Christ, I really encourage you to look into these things. There is credible evidence. And take this opportunity and take the events that will be happening next week on this campus to explore these questions some more. Thank you so much for listening.
Great. Thanks, Sharon. Can we give her a round of applause for... The video we saw at the start is promoting our week next week called More to Life. During this week, we are having a number of lunchtime talks with a free lunch, tackling topics of, so what is the evidence for the resurrection? Is there more to life than suffering? Is there more to life than romance? Is there more than injustice? The information of all the different talks can be found on your way out. We're still waiting on confirmation for a venue, so do join our Facebook page because that will be posted up there and all updates and information can be found there. We put on this event as the Christian Union because we really do believe Jesus was who he said he was, that he came and died and rose again so that we can each be in a personal relationship with him. And the best way you can find out about that is pick up a copy of Uncover Mark, open it and read it for yourself. Do talk to a Christian that you maybe came with or anyone in a blue jumper if you would like to do that with someone, if you've got any questions and want to find out more. Finally, there's also church, which is just where Christians gather, look at the Bible and see what it says. So I would encourage you, if you want to find out more about what Christians believe, and maybe you're not part of the university, that you'll talk to someone in a blue jumper, talk to the person you came with, and ask if you can come along to a church. Finally, I'd just like to ask you to join me in a final applause to thank Sharon for coming and joining us this evening.